pet the Torgal.
You can pet the Torgal.
Yeah, so we can pet Torgal in Final Fantasy 16. That's really the only thing we needed to know. That's the video.
Used to care what people thought.
Okay, obviously not really. We're here to talk about the massive showcase they had at PAX East for Final Fantasy 16. It was an hour and 5 minutes, at least the VOD they put up on YouTube. That's how long it was. We're obviously not here to break down every single aspect of an hour-long video, but we're going to talk about the things that I feel like are important. Now, luckily for us, though, we can skip like the first 11 minutes or so of this just because it's stuff that we kind of already know. Like, they show off like the dev team a bit, and they're kind of outlining what they're going to do with this event, right? So we don't really need to talk about that. I think the first thing to sort of take note of is that I believe with everything that we see at this event, it's captured in-game, right? It's not like pre-rendered cutscenes or cinematics or whatever the fuck to try to make the game look prettier than it is. Like, they're showing you what it looks like right now, playing it on PS5. Obviously, the finished product might be a little bit different. At around the 11-minute and 19 mark, we get a look at a video that shows off the 4 pillars, as they call it, which is narrative, characters, visuals, and battle. So the first thing I took note of from this was at the very beginning, Clive talks about the only reason he's here is because of Joshua, and he's waited 13 years to get this like revenge or whatever. And the first thing I took note of or wrote down was that this probably confirms that Joshua is dead, which has been a popular like idea or theory for a while. I don't know if it's ever been confirmed before this like live stream event at PAX East. But people have been saying that for a long time, that Joshua was probably going to die, and they outright confirmed that later on in this event.
I only stand here today because of Joshua. 13 years I've waited for this chance.
As for the rest of the trailer, I suppose we'll call it, like, we see some pretty cool looking like scenes, combat, enemies, things like that. Some pretty cool visuals, but there's no HUD, so there's not a whole lot to really talk about or break down from this. And we've seen some of this combat stuff before, and we see some of the Eikons fighting too later on within this video. But we get more of the actual Eikon fights like towards like the later half or so of the live stream that gives us a lot more information. But at the end of this video, we do see the Ifrit spear bomb that I was hearing about, so that's pretty cool, I guess. So we go on to learn a little bit about the mother crystals, which I always was kind of wondering what these exactly are in this story. And they make a comparison to them like oil fields, and that they kind of power their everyday life with a substance called ether, and it's like a finite resource that people are fighting over. Now, first off, this is kind of a common trope in stories, right? Like, and it's really kind of a reference to our everyday lives. They actually make that comparison as well, like, you know, that we obviously fight over resources in the real world. But when I first heard that, when we're talking about Final Fantasy, I couldn't help but think of FF7, obviously, with Mako and the live stream and Shinra and things like that, and how they use Mako to power their everyday lives. There's nothing wrong with if it's like an intentional reference or something, and maybe it's a bit derivative. It's something they've done with the series before. It's not exactly a one-to-one comparison, obviously, because like using up the live stream is killing the planet. And obviously the live stream itself is a finite resource. That they talk about the ether being like a finite resource, but they don't mention whether or not it would like kill the planet if you used it all up. So it's not exactly a one-to-one thing. But obviously as a Final Fantasy VII fan, I couldn't hear that and not think that and talk about it.
Oil fields, these mother crystals, are where the realm gains its energy that powers their everyday lives, the ether, which can be compared to oil. And so this resource, however, proves to be finite, and because of that, this bitter struggle arises amongst the nations over control of what little remains. And that brings us into the current age of war and strife.
And around about the 15-minute 45 mark, they show off that exploration kind of walkthrough video that we reacted to the other day. So they go on to talk about the Eikons and the dominance a bit, which we already know this stuff. We already kind of talked about who controls which, you know, Eikon in the past and things like that. The one thing I did take note of, though, from this is that they do say that the Eikons can range anywhere from 60 feet to 350 feet, which is pretty damn cool. Like, I like fighting gigantic monsters in games. But there is one fight that we actually see, which is like Clive/Ifrit fighting what I guess is technically an Eikon that is, it seems way fucking bigger than 350 feet. But we'll talk about that when we get there. So we learned that we'll be following Clive's journey through 3 different stages of his life. From left to right pictured, it's his teens, his 20s, and his 30s, which I thought was pretty cool, because like we knew there was going to be a time skip that was obvious. We've seen younger Clive and older Clive with like the very first reveal trailer, but I wasn't aware that like the older Clives were different. Like I just never, you know, paid that much attention, but seeing them side by side, you can see a bit of a difference here. So I thought it was kind of interesting, because we knew there was going to be a time skip, but there's actually multiple time skips. And the way they describe it is that like something kind of eventful or tragic or whatever happens at different stages of his life that kind of mold Clive into who he's going to be in this story.
Experiencing firsthand these events that shape and mold Clive, we can better understand, the player can better understand what it is that motivates him and why he eventually becomes the person that he does.
So obviously one of these eventful moments would be Joshua's death. I don't know if we know when that's supposed to happen in Clive's story. If I had to hazard a guess, it'd be like middle Clive, 20s Clive, just because of the fire in the background, the red, Ifrit, Phoenix, things like that. Stuff we've seen in the trailers, right? And then sometime like 13 years later, like he talked about at the beginning of that one video earlier in the live stream, he's finally getting his revenge in his 30s or something. That's just a guess. Something I do gotta say though is I love the idea of this, that we're gonna be getting these like time skips and playing all these different moments in like Clive's life, because a lot of times with Final Fantasy games, it's kind of linear, right? Like you start the game and you play till the end, and it's oftentimes not a lot of time passes. Just using FF7 as an example, OG FF7 is like a month, right? Like it starts around December of like year 7, and like the game ends in like January of the next year, right? It takes like a month. That's the whole story. That's all of FF7 right there. So I like that we're going to be getting these time skips and seeing just different moments in Clive's life, but also like the idea that we're going to be playing as like a 30-year-old protagonist at one point, just because oftentimes in Final Fantasy games you're playing as like teenagers, sometimes young adults. Obviously, there's other party members in like groups in Final Fantasy games that are of varying ages, but generally speaking, the protagonist and their love interest generally are quite young. Anyways, let's move it along a bit. So around the 21-40 mark, they talk about how the game starts with Clive, being obsessed to get revenge for the loss of his brother. But since he's starting out looking for revenge, and we know that Joshua is in scenes in the game, that means that we're not going to be playing in chronological order, right? We're not starting as young Clive and then moving up to his 20s and then his 30s. There's probably like flashback sequences and stuff like that. It's kind of interesting.
Story starts with Clive obsessed in his pursuit of revenge for the loss of his brother.
Unless, of course, like the Joshua death stuff happens like the very beginning of the game, essentially, right? And we just jump forward. Maybe we don't play as young Clive that long. I don't know. Also, around this part, they talk about how it's not just Clive's story, it's also Torgal's story, but I don't know if they mean that in like a literal sense, as in like there's actual narrative and stuff that's going to happen with Torgal, like a backstory or something like that, or if they're saying that it's also Torgal's story because he's traveling with Clive.
Yes, this story is not only about Clive, but it's Torgal's story as well.
So while talking about the iconic abilities, they do mention that there's many abilities to learn, upgrade, and customize. And I don't really know what they mean by customize. Like can we actually customize abilities, but like how would we customize them? Like maybe just theoretically there's like an area of effectability. Like could you make the radius bigger for like, I don't know, less damage, or maybe you make the radius a little bit smaller for more damage, like stuff like that. Is that how we can customize it? Or I don't know, have they answered this elsewhere? Like what do they mean by customize? So they roll some gameplay showing off a lot of Clive's like iconic abilities, and there's probably a lot to break down here if we went like frame by frame, because they're just constantly cycling different abilities with all the different icons that Clive has. With how much is happening, this would almost probably warrant its own video, but there are some things that I did want to touch on a little bit. First up, whenever they show off like Bahamut and Odin, there's like unique gauges that I've not seen before below the icons in the top left corner. Like with Bahamut, we're seeing the Mega Flare gauge fill up, and with Odin, we see the Zantetsuken gauge fill up. But I don't know if this is unique to just them, or if like all the icons have this, or whatever, But obviously, when it comes to those summons, we know what Mega Flare and Zantetsuken is. Right here, we see Clive use this Titan ability called Earth and Fury, which is just this badass looking like wave attack that he throws in front of him. And right here towards the end of the gameplay, we're seeing Clive fighting against the Infernal icon, which is obviously Ifrit. But if you look in the top left corner, he doesn't have Ifrit himself. So I'm wondering if this isn't tampered gameplay, kind of like the hands-on preview, or if this means that we're going to get like Phoenix and Garuda for Clive before he actually gets Ifrit. So they go into a section where they talk about like the burning questions that the community and the fans have about the game. They do point out though that this old man they're using in the background here is actually an important character. He's like the Valestean lore master who just kind of knows everything about the world essentially. So it's a character we're going to interact with at some point, obviously. So right here we have a look at all the questions they want to talk about and discuss throughout this like event. And I don't think we're going to look at all of these answers here because they're not. I don't think they even need to address some of these. So the first question they do discuss though is about like how dark the game is and kind of the linearity of it. And this is in specific reference to the hands-on preview that we had talked about previously as well. And I've never felt like this was like a valid complaint just because, for one, it's dark because it's nighttime. So that's how that works. That's how the world works. And also, like, the linearity of it, but, like, the characters are going through, like, a castle, right? They're, like, storming a castle, fight a bunch of dudes. So obviously it's not going to be this expansive, massive field because you're going through a fucking castle. But they do specify, too, that they're obviously the point of that hands-on preview was to show off, like, the gameplay, and they just so happened to choose a dark area. But also, this area they chose for that media tour was just happened to be like the first area they completed, and it was the most ready to show off the gameplay, and that's literally the only reason they chose it. Otherwise, they probably would have chose like a brighter setting if they could. It does make me kind of worry just a little bit though, just because like that media tour stuff was happening in like February or so, and like the embargo was lifted, I think like early March, right? So when we talked about it, and we're not that far from release, right? Like, we're talking like less than half a year from release, and like this like dark location was like the only one that was kind of ready to show off and play. Like we're pretty close to release, man. Like this seems like, I don't know. They say in this event at some point they don't expect any delays, but it's like you didn't have any other ready stage to show off at all. None. Around the 30-minute mark, which is pretty much the halfway point, They show some like uncut gameplay where like Yoshida picks up the controller for the PS5 that's on stage and just kind of runs around and shows off the game, which is pretty cool because it looks beautiful, right? Like they're kind of worried just because the game's still kind of an earlier stage, whether or not there's going to be any glitches or bugs or anything. But from all the gameplay that we see at this event, I don't think there's any issues at all. So they do go on to say that there are, multiple areas that are pretty decent size, and they point out that this deserty section right here is roughly about 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. So that's pretty damn good size for like a zone, right? That's kind of what we're wanting from 16. And again, bringing up FF7, what we're kind of hoping for with Rebirth. And they also point out that these like larger fields and stuff aren't just used for battling enemies and things. There's actually like towns and encampments that you can go into. So they do show off the world map for this location, which I do like the kind of like 3D aspect of it. It looks pretty damn cool. I think all the blue icons are like locations or maybe specifically like towns or encampments, just because we see that Clive's at one of those right there on the world map. So clearly there are locations. I just don't know if they're all like good guy, like human locations where you can go to or what, or if they're just general locations around the area. But we do learn later on that those green icons that are near the blue ones, the green exclamation points, are for side quests. And actually something else they point out that I forgot to mention is how it's seamless going from field into towns. So it might be something like Witcher 3 potentially, where like you fast travel to an area, and then once you're there, like everything's seamless, right? You walk into towns, you can walk into buildings, things like that.
And you see, it's all seamless from field into town.
And around the 3350 mark, they show off the fast travel system, which is pretty standard. You find a spot on the map, click on it, you go there. But they're showing off like the loading time, which of course it's fast because it's on the PS5.
And here we go. 1,
2、3、4ぐらいですね。
All right, here we are. Boom.
So at one point they want to talk about the performance thing that every game has these days, where you can put it on like for graphics or frame rate. So you're playing on 4K, you're in that 60 frames per second. But I think Yoshi P accidentally tabs over to the abilities menu because he tabs back pretty quickly.
So match it up with your playstyle. If you're more into the action and that frame rate, choose that.
So obviously we're going to take a second to look at this, right? Just because I'm assuming they didn't mean to show this off. And he actually does it at a bit of a later point too, I think. We obviously don't understand a lot of stuff that's happening here. We know there's a bunch of different abilities and you can upgrade them and customize them, as they say. And this shows off what looks like potentially a bunch of customization. See all kinds of different branching paths and things. I think some of these are obviously related to the icons, because like I think green's Garuda, the yellow color down the bottom I think should be Titan. I don't know exactly off the top of my head who purple or whatever that is on the right would be. Like the red circle in the middle looks like it's maybe just general abilities for Clive, not necessarily anything related to icons. And actually, if you pay attention, there's images behind these nodes. So in the middle, that big circle, it's actually a picture of Ifrit. In the top right, it does clearly look like Garuda to me. I still can't quite make out what that purple is on the right, though. I don't know, even with my glasses on, because I'm kind of blind without them, can't really tell what it is. And we sort of get an idea of how like the abilities work, because it's not like other games where like you level up and you get a skill point and you apply it, because you can see that things cost something. Because there's 447 ability points in the top left corner, but there's things that cost like 2,000 and shit. They go on to like load up another file to show something else, and they show off like the load screen and the save screen, which looks pretty cool. It's nothing like super special, but you can see like what level you are, what like icons you have, and who you have in your party. And obviously the pixel characters is a nice touch, kind of a throwback to OG Final Fantasy games. So load up a save file to show off the Hideaway, which is something we've heard about before in interviews. I think maybe around the time they're doing the media tour stuff earlier this month, which this is essentially like a home base, a safe house, whatever you want to call it. Whenever Clive meets Sid, you get access to this. And it's a place that you can come back to at kind of pretty much any time to kind of take a break from the main story. They have like a vendor here. They also have like a blacksmith where you can like craft and upgrade weapons and things like that. And you can kind of take a break and do like side stuff, like the arcade mode stuff that we've heard about before, also in interviews. You can access that here. So here we get to look at essentially what a shop's going to look like in the game, where Clive can buy like weapons and armors and accessories and just basic items like potions and shit. So here we get to look at the blacksmith, which I already talked about kind of previously, where you can upgrade your gear, which I like this idea just because not many Final Fantasies or RPGs in general offer stuff like this, where generally with like an RPG, like you'll buy your weapon and then you'll go to the next town and you can buy a stronger weapon, right? And you just constantly are changing out weapons. And I wonder to what extent you can keep upgrading, and can you kind of keep the same weapon throughout the entire game, essentially. So right here, they show off the Arete Stone, which this is where you access like the arcade mode and the Hall of Virtue and be able to replay stages that you previously finished, which we've talked about that before, but now we kind of know how you access that with the Hideaway. But there's also something at the bottom that's question marked, and I don't know if we even know what that is, or they've ever even talked about this at all in any capacity. So this might be something they either save for launch or talk about at a later point.
What's that? No.
Question. Secret.
Okay.
And to be honest, I'd love if they didn't talk about whatever that is. Like maybe it's like a post-game thing or a new game plus thing. Like let's go into the game not knowing literally everything, right? Like, let's save whatever that thing is for a surprise. Hopefully it's something cool. So they go on to talk about some more burning question stuff, and it's people complain about the QTEs in the boss fights, but this one I don't entirely understand just because like boss fights and QTEs, at least for me, don't really bother me. Like it's always been QTEs in cutscenes, right? Like whenever it goes into a cutscene, you walk through a door and characters start talking, and you set your controller down to like grab a drink, grab your phone, and then button prompts start flying up on screen. Like that's the issue for me. I could give a shit less about QTEs and boss fights. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. I could probably ramble off like 30 different games off the top of my head that use QTEs to this day, and nobody ever really complains about them. So I don't know why they're complaining because it's in 16. But as they talk about the QTEs, they describe it's somewhat similar to Remake, honestly, where like a lot of the boss battles and fights have phases, right? So when they're transitioning phases, whether that's like the boss is changing form or they're changing the arena or you're going to a different area during the boss fight, whatever the case, like that's when the QTEs happen, right? So it's not like this egregious thing that's just like happening all the time throughout the fight, but also they point out that if you are to fail a QTE, which would be kind of impossible because they give you plenty of time to hit the buttons, like it doesn't end up in a game over, right? Which that's really only something you see in like the cutscene QTEs anyways, usually. It's not something that generally happens in boss fights. It's just like if you don't hit the button in time, like the boss will hit you really quick and you gotta try to do that again. And obviously these are used whenever there's like cinematic things happening in a battle and they want you to feel a part of it, right? Because generally if like you get to a cinematic part of a fight, like you can put your controller down in most games, they want you to actually feel like you're a part of it, which I'm perfectly fine with. Next up, they do a pretty lengthy gameplay segment where they want to show off like regular gameplay, and then they wanted to show off gameplay when you're using like the timely accessories, which we talked about those with the hands-on preview shit, where there's like the 5 different accessories that you can equip. I think you only equip 3 at a time. And they're kind of there, of course, as sort of like an accessibility feature, right? Like if you're not very good at action RPGs, they can definitely help you to where you can combo with just one push of the button, or you can have an easier time dodging because they'll give you a bigger window of time, kind of slow down time, or it can just like auto dodge attacks for you for the most part. And the other 2 rings allow Clive to like auto heal when his HP gets to a certain point, or you can equip another ring that'll kind of make all of Torgal's actions automatic, where he'll be attacking and helping you and fighting and stuff, and you don't have to actually control that. Obviously, when this first came out, like a month ago almost, people had, I think, mostly positive feelings on this, but there was like some negative people, like that. I guess those like sweaty tryhards that think that it was so good at action RPGs, but it's like, who the fuck cares, man? At least they're making the game accessible to people that maybe aren't the biggest fans of action RPGs as well. But also, why do you give a shit how somebody else plays a video game? Like if somebody wants to, if I could equip all 5 of these, I would do it just to piss you off. And right around the hour and 30-second mark, they give us like almost a 2-minute like look at the Icon versus Icon battles, and they show off quite a bit of these. They even say going into it that it's kind of a bit of a spoiler. So this first fight they show off is against that like floating kind of humanoid guy we seen like earlier towards the beginning of the stream. I guess I didn't realize that it was an Icon. And have we ever seen this guy anywhere at all before PAX East? Because I didn't realize that this was another Icon. But if you look in the top right corner, his name is Typhon. Now, Typhon obviously was originally in Final Fantasy VI, but famously he's in Final Fantasy VII, where his name's like mistranslated into Typhoon. Actually, I had to search kind of a bit to get this picture, just because like when I was trying to search it up on Google Images, I'd seen they, I guess, maybe changed it at some point. Anyways, the point is this guy looks nothing like what Typhon looks like in 6, 7, or kind of anything else ever. But it also makes me wonder how many other icons are in 16 that we haven't been shown yet, or maybe they might save until release, potentially. Right here, we get to see a fight between Ifrit and Titan, and it gives you an idea of scale. Like, Titan is significantly bigger. And I like the idea that, for the most part, we just control Ifrit for these icon fights, and he's actually pretty small compared to the other ones, it seems. But then it rolls into Ifrit fighting Titan Loss, which is that giant monster we've seen in one of the previous shows before. And obviously, because it's called Titan Loss, it's connected to Titan. It's an icon versus icon fight, but this thing is so goddamn massive. I'm blown away by the scale in this game. But this is where I was confused with earlier, where they talk about the icons being anywhere from 60 feet to 350 feet, because this is clearly an icon versus icon fight. But Titan Lost is so much, I mean, 350 feet would be his fist, maybe. Like, his arm is so much bigger than Ifrit. So I don't know why, like, that doesn't seem like accurate to say that they go anywhere from 60 to 350 feet, because this thing is so fucking huge. It's like fight a mountain. But then we actually get to see some Phoenix icon versus icon fighting, which we kind of knew this was going to be a thing because we've seen like Phoenix staring down and like facing Ifrit, like really the first trailer for this game. But this is super unique to the other icon versus icon fights we've seen, because you're like flying around in like a cave or something, firing like Phoenix like a battleship or some shit. It's pretty cool. Then it rolls into gameplay of Ifrit fighting Odin and then Ifrit fighting Bahamut. And there's not really anything to break down from these. I mean, they look great, of course, but there's not anything like super unique standing out from these, other than the fact that this Bahamut looks so goddamn cool. But also this arena that they're fighting in right here just looks super unique and interesting. And then it ends with seeing Ifrit fighting Ifrit, which you've already seen that within some of the trailers before, but I am still very curious what the lore is on this, just because like there's supposed to be like one dominant to each icon, right? So why is there 2 Ifrits? And the last thing they touch on with this live stream that I think is, in some ways, at least for me, like one of the most important things is where's the RPG in this action RPG game? And they actually tell us that we're going to learn more about the RPG elements sometime in April.
But in the very, very near future, we're going to be releasing more information on the RPG elements of Final Fantasy 16.
And this is pretty much what you guys have been hearing me ask for, like every time we talk about Final Fantasy 16. Like the combat looks great. I'm sold on the combat. You don't have to give me any more combat gameplay trailers or anything. What are we doing besides fighting in this game? That's what I want to know. And now we're going to finally have that sometime in April. I'm just kind of curious what that's going to be exactly. Like, what are we doing outside the combat in terms of like mini games, or is there like resources or things to gather in the world? Because there was actually a brief look at that earlier, which I forgot to mention. I'll throw it here on the screen right now. So a little past the 48-minute point of the live stream, they load up the gameplay to show us the timely accessories and stuff. Like right there in front of Clive as he's running, you can see like this glowing thing on the ground. The Yoshi P kind of turns the camera away from, so I think that's something you can walk up to and collect like a resource, but I don't have confirmation on that, obviously. Anyways, this is the longest video we made in quite some time, my dudes. We don't very often make 20+ minute videos, so we're just going to kind of wrap it up. So what were your thoughts on PAX East? How excited are you or not excited are you for Final Fantasy 16 because of what we got this last weekend? For me, I wouldn't be making this long-ass video sitting here in this computer chair. My ass is killing me. I'm a couple beers deep. I wouldn't be doing all this if I wasn't excited. I cannot wait. I just want to see what more RPG elements we have for this game. Anyways, that's the video, my dudes. Subscribe to me if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @YT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain, or leave it like Cobain.